Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, I'm joined by Dr. Cheryl Thompson, Associate Professor in Performance at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University and the Director of Mapping Ontario's Black Archives. We'll be talking about her new book, Canada and the Blackface Atlantic, Performing Slavery, Conflict, and Freedom, 1812 to 1897, which is available now from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. From the War of 1812 to 18th-century British immigration through to the Jim Crow era, we explore the ways in which blackface minstrelsy spread into Canada and how black choral groups and singers simultaneously reshaped entertainment to tell their own stories. Cheryl also shares how she used archives to conduct her research and the challenges she encountered along the way, which then resulted in the formation and her directorship of the Mapping Ontario's Black Archives project. In this third episode of our series, we talk about how audiences were exposed to the opposing narratives of enslavement and emancipation as black choral groups gained popularity even as blackface minstrelsy continued. We also explore the kinds of archives Cheryl used to perform her research for the book and the challenges she encountered along the way. So you had mentioned real briefly that, scholarship around blackface and minstrelsy typically doesn't connect it to, sort of the choral groups or the Jubilee singing. Um, you know, how does what you're talking about kind of differ from what we might see in scholarship and on blackface today?
Well, I think in many ways the book is unique.
Mm-hmm.
The first reason, most books about this topic really end at the Civil War. They don't go on beyond the Civil War time period, because after 1865, like I said, the genre does change a lot, and it becomes less about this North-South conflict, because the Civil War is over. That North-South conflict, for all intents and purposes, obviously it wasn't over politically, but
Right.
in terms of a theme, it was no longer the major theme marking the Union. It just wasn't post 1865. So a lot of books in the US context, they end there. And
Mm-hmm.
then you have, which is the second book that I'm writing now, you have another era that quite a few American scholars have tackled with, and that's vaudeville. So variety theater that
Okay.
appears,
Right.
although it really appears in the 1870s, but it reaches its height in like the 1890s, 1900s, and into the 1910s. So what I noted from the sort of the canon on this topic is that there's like a big gap from the 1860s to 1890s. There aren't a lot of books that talk about what happened in that 30-year period. They sort of just kind of mention it briefly, and then they just skip to the 1890s
Mm-hmm.
when the variety theater is like at its height.
Yeah.
And there's like so much happening. So I just recognized, and again, this is also a bit of my personality. I do, in fact, March 15th was my birthday. That's just a
Oh,
couple
well,
of days
happy
ago.
birthday.
Yes, and Ides of March, if you know that significant date, that's when I'm born. And I realized that I've always just had that spirit of, if I'm going to do this, I'm doing everything.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't just do a piece of it and say, well, I just did my section. Maybe you could call that greedy. I don't know what to call it, but I just need to tell the whole story. And I just felt that that was the missing piece. And the missing piece, and I think what makes my book unique, is that, to be honest, because I am Black and a woman, the book is just going to read differently.
Yeah.
Because most scholarship in this topic has been written by white men for the most part. It's been a very much driven through that male, I would say also a male perspective on the theater. And when people say, well, what does gender have to do with it? Well, it has everything to do with it, because the way I approach a topic is that I'm always looking, this is just as an academic who has read tons of books by different authors. I can usually always tell when I'm reading a male author versus a female author. And it doesn't mean that there's anything necessarily in it. And you say, well, what are you basing that on? Well, it's because part of maleness, and again, these are very sweeping generalizations, so you can attack me, not the podcast. But in my opinion, and what I've noticed is that there's an authority to male writers. There's an assertion of almost facts, like real authority and an ability to make an argument, like unequivocally to state things in a very clear. Whereas women authors tend not to do that as much, tend to create much more of a vignette and a picture and a perspective that isn't necessarily really didactic and making huge claims. Like it's not a coincidence that most of our grand narratives have been written by men, because they tend to make really big assertions and then back it up. And so what I'm saying to you is that in reading this genre, and most of the authors that I've read on this genre have been men, I've noticed that almost, authority on the topic, and then suddenly it ends. There's a lot of these books where I'm like, okay, this was just getting good, and it ends. And I'm like, why would it end there? And then I realized why it ends there, because when you get into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the truth is you have to start to talk about women.
Well, there you go.
That's the problem. You have to. So if you look at the women who have written about the theater, they tend to focus on women in vaudeville, or like Jewish women in vaudeville. They take a very gendered approach, because that's when women enter the stage. And if it would be very difficult, I think, for some men scholars to make that transition in their writing. They're doing all this writing, and then all of a sudden to now start talking about gender politics. It would almost seem like two separate books, right? Like, because you're having to address the gender issue. Whereas for me, that's a natural transition. I'm already writing about race and class. It's like I could throw gender in there too, and talk about that, because you can't. It's almost impossible to write about the 1870s and not talk about women on the stage.
Right. Well, I imagine as a historian that when you find a gap in the scholarship, it's like kind of a little bit of a jackpot, because it's an opportunity to sort of examine that where no one else has.
Exactly. And I also noted in the sort of the all the gendered books about theater in the sort of from the 1870s through to the 1920s, to be honest, it was mostly focusing on white women. That was another gap. It was like, okay, there's a lot of white women in here. And then they would only focus on Black women in terms of exclusion, or Black women in terms of sort of the way they resisted. And I thought, I also was like, okay, that is a very narrow, that is one pathway. And even with other like Black scholars who have written about variety theater as well, I've noticed like it's always that fighting. There's just a narrative around race and gender that always seem to be like almost, setting it up as it's like one group against another, and then they're taking over. I was just like, I was kind of like, okay, I want to just maybe understand this from a different perspective, where we think about how different groups create agency for themselves. Even though obviously in the 19th century theater, there are not a lot of Black women dancing and acting. But if you take like Ada Overton Walker, for example, I write about her really in a little bit toward the end of this book, but more so in the second book. And that is a person that seemingly has been the only person that a lot of like books about vaudeville mention in terms of a Black actor and dancer. They might mention a few others, and I wanted to understand more so, how these, I guess what I'm saying to you is I sort of write from the perspective of how did they do it? Like, how did they do it? How, given everything we know of the times, we know the Jim Crow South and all of that stuff, how did these sets of people still manage to be just as popular and on the same stages as white acts at a time when there's so many limited opportunities around them? right? I sort of wanted to approach it more from an observer, and maybe it helps that I'm also not trained in theater and performance. I'm not steeped in the discipline
Yeah.
that I would use the discipline as my only means to tell the story.
Mm.
Instead, I sort of approach it as wanting to put everything into context and understanding that even though, you know, there aren't a lot of Black performers on the stage in the especially toward the end of the 19th century, they're actually innovating the stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we have to contend with the gap, sort of the presence and the absence at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. You mentioned earlier sort of the importance of when you were conducting your research, the importance of using primary sources. Can you describe sort of the kinds of archives you were using as you researched this for this book?
So a lot of newspaper archives,
Mm-hmm.
newspaper databases. Thankfully, because I started this book sort of into the pandemic, one of the good things that came out of the pandemic is that it pushed a lot of archives to start digitizing their newspaper records,
Yep.
especially,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the visual records I understand, but why do I have to come in to look at a newspaper? Like that should really be excess. And a lot of them made the switch. You can search a lot of newspapers now remotely. So that was a big shift. I also spent a lot of time in just looking at visual records, playbills,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of reading a lot of texts, even though that's really a secondary source. I found just reading the literature, like I have read the canon. Um, I've just read everything there was to read. And then I would look at lithographic prints in particular, because especially from lithography really becomes popular in the 1870s onward. And some of those prints are so, it's like you just see one and it kind of tells the story of
Yeah.
what the show was probably about. And, I was also really fascinated with the visual culture coming out of, even though my PhD is in communication studies, it was in an art history and communication studies department at McGill. So I also took art history classes. So
Mm-hmm.
I did get some training in like reading the visual and understanding images within a social, cultural, political context. That it's not just about what's in the frame. It's sort of thinking about like, so even in there's parts of the book that I think I kind of show a little bit of those skills, talking about like who published this, where would it have circulated, like thinking beyond the frame of like how people receive the work. And so the visual archive was really important to spend time. And it was, I say that as I also reflect now and say that was really tough work, because at the end of the day, I was looking at really racist images, okay? Like really racist images that was like, ooh, some of them are still in here where it's like, even talking
Yeah.
about it, I could see some of them. And you're thinking, oh God. And I remember once when I was doing the research for this book, I was not yet faculty at Toronto Metropolitan University. I was at a different university. I was using the communal, like the computer room,
Mm-hmm.
where everyone's kind of sitting. And I was going through some of these images because I was labeling them. And I just remember hearing people walk by like, what is she looking at? Like little
Yeah.
whispers, like, because people were like, obviously you're seeing this, you're thinking it's, God, it's so shocking. But through the process, why I know I have been chosen to do this work. And not to sound too grandiose, but I truly believe I've been chosen because my sister actually said this to me on the weekend. She said, you have a unique ability to be sensing but not sensitive.
Mm.
And it's that was just bang on. It's like I can sense things and I can really absorb things, but for whatever reason, I it doesn't stay. Like I have a sort of Teflon shield, I guess, to a lot of things. So I'm able to go back into the record and look at really racist, even reading some of the newspaper columns, that's not a light read either. Like
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that they would say and how they would describe certain situations. But I just have this unique ability, I think, to disconnect from it and to really see myself as, there was a film many years ago called Voices from the Dead. It's like I sort of see myself as being that person who was chosen in this present moment to bring all of those stories out of the past and sort of contextualize them for people who had no voice back then
Hmm.
and maybe no ability to even access the newspaper
Right.
through, they weren't literate, didn't have funds, were working how many hours a day because we didn't have standard work days then. So they wouldn't even have the time and leisure time to even know what was being said about them. Right.
Hmm.
So I sort of did all of that. And that took many years to collect it all. And then thankfully I'm a faculty member who won grants so that I could hire research assistants who I do shout out in the book because I've worked with many research assistants to catalog all of this. Like I needed someone to transcribe all the newspaper articles, index it for me so I have dates, create a spreadsheet. So when I was writing, I could search a date and I would find the articles.
Hmm.
I basically needed to create my own system to contain all of the materials. And the same thing with the images. I needed them all dated, named, and cataloged. That in itself took like 3 years, just that before I could even start writing. And then the collection of that materials. So that's why the book took so long. It
Yeah.
took about 7 years to collect everything, 3 years to transcribe it, and about 4 or 5 years to write.
Wow. Okay.
So
That's
we're talking
amazing.
about a serious investment in telling this story. That's why.
Absolutely.
And that's why I say I have to have been chosen because who's going to commit? Who's going to make that kind of commitment?
True.
Most people wouldn't even commit to a marriage that
Right.
long,
Right.
let alone, right? Like
Right.
the level of commitment and dedication to stay on this topic,
Hmm.
to also understand what to do with the material. Because I think if when I look at it all, it was probably about 400 newspaper articles, something like 150 images, and maybe in that I would say somewhere between 100 and 150 books that I had to read first, and then maybe 50 to 60 journal articles on top of that. So we're talking about a major, massive corpus
Hmm.
of like maybe 1,000 items in different categories. So that alone, right? It's like a massive. So I always say that, author takes the credit, but it's really a team
Yeah.
to put all that together because I couldn't have done it by myself.
That's excellent. So you related an anecdote in a conversation we had before this recording around, you mentioned, your sense of sense versus sensitivity, that perhaps some of the archivists or librarians that were providing access to some of these archives, they were reacting in particular ways when they saw you researching these materials. I'm wondering if you could, talk a little bit about that and sort of this idea that, archives can end up having a little bit of a protectionist characteristic around materials that either are not looked at very often because of the subject matter or because there's sort of a feeling of guilt or, you know, around having those materials in the archive in the first place,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
and how that affects access to them. Yeah.
I think it's a combination of all that.
Yeah.
Like, yes, to everything you just said,
Okay.
right? It's a combination of sometimes just shock, like, oh, we have that in the collection. Oh, like because they might have seen the record, but they might not have seen the actual thing when it's right.
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
like and I know this enough from working in archives. Often they're also just curious because they work there, but they actually don't know what anything necessarily looks like.
Yeah.
Like they're not looking at all the materials all the time. So when you come and you ask to look at something, sometimes, yes, it is just genuine curiosity because they've never seen the contents of whatever it is that you asked to look at. I understand that. But I found in this process, there was a lot of just a lot of questioning of my motivation, I
Yeah.
think.
Right.
That just seemed a little bit different, right?
Hmm.
It was very nuanced. It wasn't just I'm so curious to see what these contents are. It was a question of why are you
Why?
asking for these contents, which is obviously a different sort of impetus for the question. And so that to me was something that I came across very frequently, and I would always have to remind them, well, these are public records. One, two, I'm a researcher and I'm working on a book project that I actually don't have to share with you because
Right.
I don't I at that stage I didn't even really know what the book was anyway. Right, I was really just collecting materials. And also third, I would always say, you know the archive is not there to sanitize the materials. You can't. Like, history is what it is. And
Mm.
I think we're, especially now, we're living in a time where, I don't know, when people are like, let's go back, I'm like, what decade was Camelot? Like, I'm trying to understand what decade was the real Nirvana that we're
Mm.
trying to go back to. Because as a person who studies really about 3 centuries, I can't find one that anyone would really want to return to if they had any sanity at all. Because the world, as you go back decades and as you go back centuries, has a completely different consciousness. And one of the things in writing histories that I always say is that it's not my job to judge the consciousness, however, right? And I
Mhm.
felt that through the archive, I was somehow being judged because I was going back and wanting to recuperate actual historical records. And that was the part that was really shocking because I've always known that you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from. So this idea that we can sweep things under the rug and hope that
Yeah.
nobody comes and see, it's just not a realistic outcome to do that. So I think in many ways, this work is going to help people to realize um, that just because you try to suppress history, it doesn't mean that it's not going to see the day of light, right? And
Right.
um, but yeah, that pushback was really shocking.
You just heard from Dr. Cheryl Thompson, Associate Professor in Performance at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University, Director of Mapping Ontario's Black Archives, and author of Canada and the Blackface Atlantic, Performing Slavery, Conflict, and Freedom, 1812 to 1897. Join us next week when we talk about the Mapping Ontario's Black Archives project, what it does, and how it came together. This series is underwritten with generous support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.